My own daughter looked me dead in the eye during my brother's funeral proceedings and told our entire family that I had stolen $500,000 from him while he lay in a coma. That single, carefully calculated lie stripped me of my $12 million inheritance and left me to rot in an isolated mountain cabin for 5 years. They erased me from their lives as if I had never existed. But last month, when her organs began to fail and her perfect husband secretly prepared to leave her for dead, the doctor asked who in the family was a match to save her life. The whole room fell silent, and all eyes slowly turned to the man they had thrown away. Me. Before I tell you how I walked into that hospital room and made the most ruthless decision of my entire life, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth and tried to break you. The heavy oak doors of Harrison Cole's law office were supposed to keep the noise of the city out, but they could not keep the impending disaster from rushing in. We had just buried my older brother William. He was a self-made millionaire who built a logistics empire from the ground up, and his passing had left a $12 million hole in our family. I was sitting quietly at the edge of the long mahogany conference table, still wearing my black morning suit, processing the grief of losing the only sibling I had left. Then the silence of the room was violently shattered. My daughter Natalie stood up abruptly. Her chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. She was 40 years old, an art director, who always prided herself on her elegant composure, but right now her face was twisted in an expression of pure theatrical agony. She reached into her designer leather bag and slammed a thick stack of bank statements directly onto the center of the table. The loud smack made everyone jump. "I found it!" she sobbed, her voice trembling so perfectly it could have won an award. "I found out where the missing money went. Uncle William trusted us and someone betrayed him while he was fighting for his life." Harrison Cole. Our longtime family lawyer adjusted his glasses and looked at the papers. His face went completely pale. Natalie turned her body and pointed a shaking finger directly at me. "It was you, Dad. How could you do this to him? How could you steal from your own brother while he was lying in a hospital bed in a coma?" The entire room gasped. My nephew Brian jumped up from his seat, his face turning red with sudden fury. My son-in-law, Jason, placed a comforting hand on Natalie's shoulder, pulling her close as she buried her face in his chest to cry. I sat there completely frozen. I am Richard Caldwell. I am 70 years old. I spent 40 years of my life as a structural engineer. My hands have calculated the load, bearing stress of massive steel bridges across the Delaware River. I have spent my entire existence measuring weight pressure and stability. But in that moment, looking down at those printed bank statements, my hands began to tremble uncontrollably. Right there, highlighted in bright yellow ink, were 6 separate wire transfers totaling $450,000. The money had been moved from William's private medical trust into an offshore shell account over the course of 3 weeks. And at the bottom of every single authorization form was my digital signature. "I did not do this," I said, my voice sounding hollow and weak in the massive room. "That is my signature, but I never signed those documents. I do not even know what that account is." "Do not lie to us," Brian shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "You were the only one with emergency access to his medical trust. You saw an opportunity and you took it. You stole $500,000 from a dying man." I looked around the room, desperately searching for a single friendly face. I looked at Natalie, my own flesh and blood, the girl I had raised and provided for. She refused to meet my eyes. Instead, I saw Jason staring at me over the top of Natalie's head. He was wiping his eyes with a handkerchief, pretending to mourn the betrayal, but I saw it. The subtle, unmistakable twitch of his lip. A smirk. He was enjoying this. Harrison Cole cleared his throat loudly, demanding order in the room. He picked up a secondary file folder from his briefcase, and he looked at me with deep disappointment. "Richard," he said softly, "given the irrefutable evidence presented here today, I am legally obligated to activate a supplementary clause that Natalie submitted to the estate last week. A supplementary clause, I asked, feeling the ground open up beneath my feet. What are you talking about? Natalie pulled away from Jason and stood tall. I filed an emergency injunction, she said coldly. Uncle William told me before he was sedated that he suspected funds were missing. He gave me the authority to act as the primary executor if fraud was discovered. Harrison sighed heavily and read from the document. The clause states that any beneficiary found guilty of financial misconduct regarding the estate will be immediately and irrevocably stripped of their inheritance. Richard, as of this moment, you are removed from William's will. The $12 million will be divided evenly between Natalie and Brian. The air was sucked out of my lungs. It was not about the money. I had my pension. I did not need millions to live. It was about the absolute calculated destruction of my character. My daughter had orchestrated an elaborate lie to frame me for a federal crime solely to eliminate me from the inheritance pool and take my share. Get out, Brian sneered, pointing toward the heavy oak doors. Get out of here before I call the police and have you arrested for theft. You are dead to us. I stood up slowly. My knees ached and my chest felt tight, but the panic inside me was rapidly cooling into a strange, terrifying clarity. I did not yell. I did not plead. I did not waste my breath trying to convince a room full of vultures that I was innocent. A structural engineer knows that when a building is rigged to implode, you do not try to stop the blast. You step back, study the demolition, and find out exactly who planted the explosives. I looked at Natalie one last time. She crossed her arms, her chin raised in defiance, secure in her stolen victory. I looked at Jason, who quickly hid his smirk behind his hand again. I will leave, I said quietly, my voice steady and cold. But remember this day, Natalie. Remember exactly what you did here. Because the truth is like water. It always finds a way out. I turned my back on my family and walked out of the law office, leaving $12 million and my entire past behind those heavy oak doors. I had nothing but my pension and my shattered pride. But as I stepped out into the cold Chicago air, I knew one thing for certain. I was going to find out where that $450,000 really went. And when I did, I was going to tear their perfect, wealthy lives apart, brick by stolen brick. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me, severing my ties to the only family I had left. A security guard in a dark gray suit immediately stepped to my side, his hand hovering near his radio. He did not say a word, but the message was clear. I was being escorted off the premises like a common criminal. We walked down the long carpeted hallway toward the elevators. My footsteps felt heavy dragging against the plush fabric, but I kept my back straight. I refused to let the guard see the devastating toll those forged bank statements had taken on my mind. My brain, trained for decades to find structural flaws, was racing to understand the mechanics of the trap that had just snapped shut around me. The evidence they presented was undeniably ironclad to a legal outsider. My secure digital signature, the one I used to authorize William's emergency medical procedures, was stamped perfectly on every single fraudulent wire transfer. Whoever set me up knew exactly how to bypass the standard authentication protocols. They knew my routines. They knew my passwords. They knew exactly how to make me look completely guilty. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. I stepped inside and the guard pressed the button for the lobby. As the glass cab descended, giving me a sweeping view of the gray Chicago skyline. My thoughts drifted back to the conference room. I did not waste energy on anger. Anger is a volatile emotion that makes you careless. Instead, I focused my mind entirely on Jason Bennett, the commercial real estate broker, with a taste for bespoke Italian suits and a lifestyle he could never truly afford. I replayed the memory of his face from just a few minutes ago. While my daughter Natalie wept bitter tears of manufactured betrayal, Jason had pulled her close, playing the role of the protective, grieving husband. But I had seen the truth hiding just beneath his polished surface. When he brought that crisp white handkerchief to his face, he was not wiping away tears. He was hiding a smirk. It was a fleeting expression lasting barely a second, but for an engineer, a tiny microfracture is all you need to see to know a building is going to collapse. Jason was the weak point in their story. He was a man who drove a luxury sports car but constantly complained about the rising cost of property taxes. He was a man who boasted about massive commercial deals at family dinners, but always seemed desperate for liquid cash. He had the motive, and living under the same roof as Natalie, he certainly had the access to my digital credentials. The elevator reached the ground floor with another gentle chime. The security guard stepped aside, pointing toward the revolving glass doors that led out to the busy street. I nodded to him politely, buttoned my wool coat against the biting wind, and walked out into the unforgiving afternoon. I hailed a passing taxi and gave the driver the address to my house. The ride was a blur of gray concrete and gray clouds. My mind was already calculating my next moves. I could not fight them in a courtroom right now. They had the element of surprise, the fabricated evidence, and the vast resources of Williams' estate at their immediate disposal. I had to retreat. I had to disappear from their radar so they would feel comfortable enough to make a mistake. The taxi pulled up to my modest brick house in the suburbs. It was a quiet neighborhood filled with working-class families and old trees. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The silence of the empty living room hit me harder than usual. I walked straight to my bedroom and pulled a sturdy canvas duffel bag from the top shelf of my closet. I was not going to pack memories. I was only going to pack survival. I gathered a week's worth of warm clothing, my heavy winter boots, and my shaving kit. I went into my home office and packed my laptop, my external hard drives, and every single financial document I could find relating to my own pension and savings. I needed to ensure they could not freeze my personal assets with their false accusations. I walked through the kitchen and paused by the counter. I looked at the coffee mug I had used that morning, completely unaware that my life was about to be dismantled. I left it sitting in the sink. I did not want to take anything that connected me to the man I was yesterday. That man was a trusting father. The man leaving this house was an engineer preparing for a controlled demolition. I slung the heavy duffel bag over my shoulder and walked out the front door, locking the deadbolt behind me. I walked down the driveway to my reliable 10-year-old truck. I tossed the bag onto the passenger seat and climbed behind the steering wheel. I put the key in the ignition, but before I could turn it, the silence of the vehicle was interrupted by a sharp electronic vibration. My cell phone was buzzing inside my coat pocket. I pulled it out and stared at the bright digital screen. The caller identification displayed a name I had just sworn to excise from my life. It was Natalie. For a long moment, I simply watched the screen illuminate the dim interior of the truck. Why would she be calling me now? She had just publicly humiliated me, stripped me of my inheritance, and threatened me with federal prison. The logical move was to ignore it and drive away. But logic also dictates that you must always listen to the enemy when they are eager to speak. I took a slow, deep breath, steadying my heart rate, ensuring that my voice would carry absolutely no trace of fear. I pressed the green button on the screen. I pressed the phone to my ear and held my breath. "Hello," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat and devoid of the rage simmering inside my chest. "Dad," Natalie replied. Her voice was shockingly soft, coated in a thick layer of fabricated sympathy. It was the tone a person uses when speaking to a frightened child or a wounded animal. "I am so glad you picked up. I was worried you might do something rash." I remained silent, letting her fill the empty space. When a liar is met with silence, they inevitably start spinning their web faster to cover the uncomfortable void. "Listen, Dad," she continued, lowering her voice as if sharing a painful family secret. "I know today was hard for you. I know it felt cruel. But you have to understand that I did this for your own good and for the good of Uncle William's legacy. You have been so confused lately. Your memory is slipping. We have all seen it. You are getting older, and your aging, confused mind simply cannot handle the burden of a $12 million estate. you would have been taken advantage of. You would have thrown that money away on useless charities or terrible investments. I had to step in and take control before you ruined everything William built." The sheer audacity of her words was breathtaking. She was attempting to gaslight me into believing that my perfectly healthy, mathematically precise brain was failing. She wanted me to believe that framing me for a federal crime was an act of mercy. "I know you are probably scared about your future now," she whispered sweetly. "But Jason and I discussed it, and we are not going to leave you out in the cold. We are family, after all. We are going to set up a secure monthly allowance for you. $2,000 every single month deposited directly into your checking account. It is more than enough for you to live quietly and comfortably. All you have to do is accept this arrangement, step back, and let us handle the heavy lifting. Do not talk to lawyers, do not make a fuss. Just let it go, Dad." I sat in the driver's seat of my truck, gripping the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned completely white. My daughter was offering me a pathetic $2,000 stipend to buy my silence paid out from the $12 million fortune she had just stolen from me. She wanted me to tuck my tail between my legs, accept her pocket change, and fade into the background like a senile old fool. If I were a different man, I would have screamed. I would have cursed her name, threatened to call the police, and promised a legal war that would drain every last cent of that estate. But an engineer knows that revealing your countermeasures to the enemy only gives them time to reinforce their defenses. I needed her to believe that her manipulation had worked flawlessly. I needed Jason to feel completely victorious and secure in his stolen wealth. "No, thank you, Natalie," I said. My voice was quiet, sounding appropriately defeated and broken. "Keep your money." "Dad, please be reasonable." She started to argue, but I did not let her finish the sentence. I pulled the phone away from my ear and ended the call. I turned the device off entirely, pulled the battery out, and tossed it into the passenger footwell. I did not argue. I did not threaten. I simply vanished from her radar. Let her sit in her luxurious Chicago home and assume that she had successfully crushed my spirit. Overconfidence is the absolute greatest weakness of a thief. I turned the key in the ignition. The old engine roared to life, shaking the sturdy frame of my truck. I put the vehicle in gear and drove away from my house, away from the life I had known, and away from the city that held the people who had betrayed me. I drove west for 2 straight days. I crossed the endless flat plains of the Midwest, watching the landscape slowly shift from urban sprawl to open farmland, and finally to the towering snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains. I needed isolation. I needed a place where the air was thin and the distractions were non-existent. I settled in a small weathered timber cabin high up in the rugged mountains of Colorado. The cabin was as basic as a shelter could possibly be. It had a wood-burning stove for heat, a small kitchenette with a rusty sink, and a single bedroom that barely fit a mattress. The floors creaked under my heavy boots, and the winter wind howled relentlessly against the frosted window panes. It was a stark, brutal contrast to the imported granite countertops and heated marble floors that Jason and Natalie were currently enjoying in Chicago. But to me, this isolated wooden box was a perfect strategic headquarters. I paid for a 6-month lease up front using cash from my modest engineer's pension. My pension was not a fortune, but it was honest money, and it was completely untethered from William's estate. It was enough to buy firewood, basic groceries, and a secure satellite internet connection. While my family popped expensive champagne and celebrated their newfound status as multimillionaires, I was chopping logs in the freezing cold and eating canned soup. They thought I was living a life of miserable exile. They believed I was shivering in the dark, mourning the loss of my family and my wealth. They could not have been more wrong. I carried my canvas duffel bag into the cramped bedroom and dropped it onto the rough wooden floorboards. But instead of resting, I opened my heavy laptop and immediately connected it to the secure satellite network. Then I picked up my newly purchased burner cell phone and finally made a highly confidential, encrypted phone call. The voice on the other end of the secure line was exceptionally sharp and deeply professional. I was speaking directly to the senior managing partner of an elite private intelligence firm based out of Washington. These individuals were not your standard tax preparers or basic financial advisors. They were highly trained forensic accountants. Many of them were former federal investigators who specialized exclusively in tracing hidden assets, unraveling massive corporate fraud, and breaking through the most complex offshore financial barriers known to modern banking. I identified myself immediately and stated my business with absolute clarity. I told them I needed a phantom financial audit conducted without leaving a single trace. I explained that exactly $450,000 had been illegally moved using a digitally forged signature, and I desperately needed to know the final destination of every single stolen cent. I immediately wired them a substantial retainer, using a significant portion of my remaining life savings. It was a massive personal financial risk, but a seasoned structural engineer fully understands that you absolutely cannot repair a dangerously compromised foundation without first paying for the proper diagnostic imaging. If that vast amount of money was moved, it definitely left a permanent digital footprint. Numbers do not simply vanish into thin air without a trace. They travel constantly through hidden servers, international routing numbers, and offshore holding accounts. I gave the accounting firm strict non-negotiable instructions. They were required to operate with absolute airtight secrecy at all times. Neither Jason nor Natalie could ever discover that they were currently being investigated by professionals. The firm accepted my terms without hesitation, and the incredibly meticulous process of untangling my family's elaborate deception finally began. With the investigation underway, I settled into my new reality in the harsh Colorado mountains. I needed my family to believe I was completely defeated. I needed them to picture me as a broken old man, withering away in shame and poverty. So I fully embraced the Spartan lifestyle of my isolated cabin. My daily routine was stripped down to the bare essentials of survival. I woke up before dawn every single morning. I spent hours swinging a heavy steel axe, cutting and splitting dense pine logs to keep my small wood-burning stove fed. The physical labor was exhausting, leaving my 70-year-old muscles aching and my hands covered in fresh calluses, but it kept my mind exceptionally sharp. When I was not chopping wood, I was down by the freezing river catching trout to supplement my meager grocery supply. I let my beard grow out wild and unkempt. I wore the same faded flannel shirts and thick denim pants every day. Occasionally, I would drive my old truck down the winding mountain roads into the nearest small town to buy basic supplies. I paid for everything in cash. I made sure to look tired, beaten, and entirely unremarkable to anyone who might pass by. If Natalie or Jason ever decided to check up on me, perhaps by hiring a cheap private investigator of their own to ensure I was not plotting a legal counterattack, they would only find exactly what they expected to see. They would see a ghost haunting a wooden shack. But inside that shack, my mind was running complex stress tests on their entire lives. I knew Jason was a creature of comfort and excess. I knew his ego was much larger than his actual business acumen. The seasons slowly changed. The brilliant autumn leaves fell, giving way to a brutal snow-covered winter. The isolation was profound, but I never once felt lonely. The quiet of the mountains gave me the absolute clarity I needed to survive. Then, exactly 6 months after I was exiled from the law office, the breakthrough finally happened. It was a freezing Tuesday evening. The wind was howling violently outside the cabin, rattling the thick wooden shutters. I was sitting close to the stove, drinking a cup of bitter black coffee, when my secure laptop suddenly chimed. A heavily encrypted email had just arrived in my private inbox. The sender was the lead forensic accountant from the Washington firm. I set my coffee mug down on the rough wooden table. My heart beat steadily in my chest as I typed in the complex decryption password. The screen illuminated the dark room, displaying a massive, highly detailed financial dossier. I scrolled past the summary pages and dove directly into the raw data. The accountants had completely shattered the firewall surrounding the offshore shell account. They had followed the digital trail of the $450,000 across 3 different countries, through 6 dummy corporations, and finally to its ultimate destination. I stared at the glowing screen tracing the flow of the stolen funds. The money had not been stolen by me. It had not been used for any medical expenses. The stolen capital had been funneled directly into a massive, catastrophic financial black hole created entirely by Jason. The detailed report laid out a staggering trail of corporate fraud. Jason had not just made a few bad investments. He had actively embezzled over $3 million from his commercial real estate clients. He had been quietly shifting funds from their escrow accounts to finance his own failing side projects and his lavish personal lifestyle. The $450,000 stolen from my brother was a desperate, panicked attempt to cover a margin call on a defaulted commercial loan before the federal authorities noticed his dark and massive deficit. The terrible truth finally hit me with the crushing force of a physical blow. Natalie did not frame me because she simply wanted a larger share of the $12 million inheritance. She framed me out of pure cold and calculated desperation. My own adult daughter had deliberately sacrificed my long-standing reputation, my financial security, and my entire life just to keep her fraudulent husband out of a federal prison permanently. I sat in the freezing, absolute silence of my remote wooden cabin staring at the glowing screen of my laptop. The sheer weight of the betrayal threatened to crush the breath right out of my lungs. The financial dossier provided by the highly trained forensic accountants was not just a collection of numbers and banking codes. It was a perfectly documented timeline of my daughter's absolute moral collapse. I now held in my hands the exact proof I needed to completely clear my name. With one phone call to the federal authorities, I could hand over the encrypted file. The investigators would immediately freeze the stolen assets. Jason would be dragged out of his high-rise office in handcuffs, facing a massive, unavoidable mountain of embezzlement charges. Natalie would undoubtedly be charged as an active co-conspirator for covering up his federal crimes and forging my signature on William's medical trust documents. The revenge I had been quietly dreaming about for the last 6 months was sitting right there on my hard drive, perfectly packaged and ready to be deployed. I could burn their entire luxurious world to the ground before the morning sun came up over the high, snowy mountains. I closed my eyes and let the raw, blinding anger wash over me. It would have been incredibly easy to pick up my burner phone and call the local police. The temptation to end their comfortable lives right then and there was a living, breathing force inside the small room. But I am a structural engineer. My entire professional life was dedicated to understanding the precise mechanics of collapse. I know exactly how and why complex systems fail. I know that if you strike a weakened pillar prematurely, the resulting structural damage is chaotic, unpredictable, and very often completely incomplete. An engineer knows that you never blow up a bridge while the enemy is still sitting safely and comfortably at the toll booth. If I handed the dossier over to the authorities, now Jason would immediately deploy his expensive defense attorneys. He would try to tie the criminal case up in endless litigation for years. He would undoubtedly use the millions he stole from my brother's estate to pay his legal fees, slowly bleeding the stolen inheritance dry while he sat comfortably at home on bail. I could not allow him the luxury of a prolonged, incredibly comfortable legal defense. I truly needed a much more permanent, definitive, and satisfying outcome. I realized very quickly that sending them to federal prison right now would actually be an act of mercy. It would immediately stop them from doing any further damage to themselves. But Jason was a man infected with an incurable disease. He was completely, hopelessly addicted to the dangerous illusion of wealth. He was completely obsessed with maintaining his image as a brilliant, highly successful real estate tycoon. A man with that level of extreme financial arrogance cannot simply stop spending. He absolutely cannot suddenly learn how to live a quiet, modest, frugal life. If I stepped back and gave him enough rope, he would inevitably hang himself. I firmly decided in that exact moment that I would not report them. I would not intervene at all. I would intentionally stay completely hidden in my isolated mountain cabin and let their own insatiable greed serve as their executioner. I would wait very patiently until their fragile house of cards grew so tall and unstable that it had no choice but to collapse under its own massive crushing weight of their spectacularly terrible, totally unforgivable decisions day after single day. To ensure I did not miss a single moment of their impending downfall, I needed to establish a comprehensive surveillance network. I used my laptop to build a highly sophisticated automated tracking system. I set up continuous digital alerts on every single piece of property associated with Jason and Natalie. I constantly monitored county clerk websites for new public filings, mortgage recordings, and lien notices. I tracked the business registries for any new limited liability companies Jason might attempt to create in secret. I set up alerts for their names in civil court databases, waiting patiently for the inevitable lawsuits from his defrauded commercial clients. Every single time they made a significant financial move, signed a new legal document, or registered a corporate entity, an automated notification would be sent directly to my secure email inbox. I essentially turned my small wooden table in the middle of the Colorado wilderness into a powerful private intelligence hub. I became the completely invisible architect of their destruction, watching their every single move from over 1,000 miles away. I quietly chopped my firewood. I silently caught my trout. I lived like a ghost, waiting for the first major structural crack to appear. I certainly did not have to wait very long. The notification arrived late one Tuesday afternoon during the spring thaw. The loud chime from my laptop echoed through the quiet cabin. I walked over to the screen and opened the automated alert. The county recorder office in Illinois had just registered a massive brand new property deed. Jason and Natalie had officially purchased a sprawling historical mansion in one of the most exclusive, highly expensive neighborhoods in Chicago. The total purchase price was a staggering $4 million. The documents confirmed that Jason had used his half of my brother William's $12 million inheritance to pay for the entire estate in full cash. It was a massive, incredibly foolish display of wealth. He truly thought the stolen inheritance had permanently saved him from ruin. He believed he had successfully covered his tracks and could now live exactly like a king. But looking at the property taxes, the maintenance costs, and the sheer, overwhelming scale of the estate, I immediately knew the absolute truth. A $4 million house requires an endless stream of massive income to maintain. The trap was now officially set. The massive bleeding had finally begun. The years began to slip past me with the slow and relentless rhythm of a mountain winter. During the second and third years of my exile, my digital surveillance network painted a vivid picture of a family entirely consumed by their own arrogant vanity. Natalie and Jason were desperately trying to purchase their way into Chicago high society. The automated alerts on my laptop documented a parade of staggering expenditures. They purchased matching imported luxury vehicles, the kind that lose half their value the moment their tires touch the pavement outside the dealership. They hosted wildly expensive catered galas at their $4 million estate, inviting local politicians, minor celebrities, and wealthy investors to dine on imported delicacies. They posed for glossy society magazines, smiling brightly with perfectly whitened teeth, playing the absolute ultimate role of the flawless, highly successful power couple. They wanted the entire city to believe that they possessed an endless, bottomless well of generational wealth. They hired professional landscaping teams to manicure their sprawling lawns and private chefs to prepare their daily meals. Every single public appearance was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to project an aura of total financial invincibility. I watched their glittering performance from the freezing isolation of my mountain cabin. As they clinked expensive crystal glasses in temperature-controlled ballrooms, I was outside swinging a heavy iron axe against frozen pine wood just to keep my bones from freezing in the night. The Colorado winters were brutally harsh. The snow would pile up against my wooden door, completely sealing me off from the rest of the world for days at a time. The wind howled through the deep canyons, rattling the glass panes of my single window. I ate simple meals of canned beans and dried meat. My clothes were frayed and my hands were cracked from the unforgiving cold. But my existence, as harsh and unforgiving as it was was built entirely on a solid foundation of undeniable truth. Every single log I chopped and every single meal I ate was paid for with my honest, hard-earned pension. I went to sleep every single night with a completely clear conscience, listening to the quiet settling of the timber roof. Natalie and Jason were sleeping on imported silk sheets, but their entire reality was a desperately fragile fiction. Their warmth was stolen, and I knew with absolute certainty that the bitter cold of reality was coming for them very soon. A building constructed on a swamp of lies will always eventually sink deep into the mud. My secure connection to the Washington forensic accounting firm provided me with quarterly updates that told the real story happening behind their heavily filtered photographs. Jason was not simply spending William's $12 million inheritance on designer clothes and expensive parties. He was actively, frantically funneling the vast majority of that stolen wealth into a massive, catastrophic financial blender. The accountants had traced his frantic wire transfers into a sprawling, desperately constructed Ponzi scheme. The $3 million he had previously embezzled from his commercial real estate clients had created a gaping, bleeding wound in his professional portfolio. Those angry clients had started asking extremely aggressive questions about their missing returns. To keep them from going to the federal authorities, Jason used the stolen inheritance to pay off the old investors, disguising the stolen family money as legitimate project yields. He was robbing Peter to pay Paul, but his exorbitant personal expenses were rapidly accelerating the daily burn rate. To keep the illusion of his own wealth completely intact, he had to keep borrowing more, creating fake corporate entities to move the remaining inheritance back and forth until the original principal was entirely devoured by interest-fake dividends and his own unstoppable personal spending. He was literally burning the bridge while he was still standing right in the middle of it. The forensic accountants noted that he was moving money weekly, sometimes daily, shifting balances to avoid triggering banking oversight limits. It was the digital behavior of a man who was quietly suffocating under the weight of his own massive deception. He was trapped in a dark cycle of his own making, and the stolen inheritance was the only thing keeping the federal investigators from knocking on his front door. I watched the financial data validate every single theory my analytical engineering mind had constructed over the past 36 months. A solid physical structure can withstand a truly massive amount of external wind pressure, but toxic internal rot will always eventually compromise the main load-bearing beams. By the end of the third calendar year, the stolen money was moving faster and faster, a very sure sign of a desperate man drowning in deep water and thrashing violently to stay afloat. He was rapidly running out of my brother's stolen money, and the walls were closing in on his perfect life. I sat at my rough wooden table one dark evening, quietly watching a fierce winter blizzard whip across the distant mountain peaks, when the familiar sharp chime of my laptop suddenly broke the heavy silence of the small room. A priority red flag had just tripped on my automated digital monitoring software. I carefully opened the encrypted message and read the newly filed county property records. Jason had just taken out a predatory, extremely high-interest secondary mortgage on their gorgeous $4 million Chicago mansion. He was officially out of cash. The massive bleeding was no longer just a slow, hidden leak behind closed doors. It had finally become a fatal, unstoppable hemorrhage. The incredibly toxic debt was now physically attached to the very roof over their heads. My daughter had completely destroyed my entire life to protect a man who was now systematically destroying hers. The brutal countdown to their absolute catastrophic destruction had officially entered its final, undeniable stage. I just sat there and watched the bright, glowing screen, knowing that my long patience was finally about to pay off. The fourth year of my isolation brought the inevitable structural failure I had predicted. The massive Ponzi scheme Jason had constructed to hide his original embezzlement finally buckled under the immense pressure of its own toxic weight. You can only rob Peter to pay Paul for so long before Peter demands to see the actual foundation of his investment. My automated monitoring system, which had been tracking their slow descent for months, suddenly erupted into a constant chaotic stream of priority alerts. The digital alarms echoed through my cabin at all hours. Jason had missed a critical string of quarterly dividend payments to his earliest, most aggressive commercial real estate investors. The illusion of his spectacular market success evaporated overnight. The angry investors did exactly what I knew they would do. They hired ruthless corporate litigators. Within a matter of weeks, a devastating avalanche of civil lawsuits struck every single limited liability company Jason had ever registered in the state of Illinois. The court filings detailed allegations of gross financial negligence, breach of fiduciary duty, and outright corporate fraud. His disgruntled clients were demanding millions in immediate restitution money that no longer existed because Jason had already burned through it to maintain his luxurious facade. His corporate bank accounts were swiftly frozen by court orders. His professional reputation was shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces among the wealthy elite of Chicago. With her husband facing an absolute barrage of vicious civil litigation and their primary sources of income completely severed, the terrifying reality of their situation finally crashed down onto Natalie. She was a woman who had built her entire identity on the fragile perception of endless wealth and high social status. The very thought of public bankruptcy, of losing her sprawling mansion, and being ostracized by the elite circles she had desperately clawed her way into, was a fate worse than death to her. To prevent the high-interest secondary mortgage from immediately defaulting and triggering a highly public foreclosure, my daughter resorted to the most desperate measures imaginable. My forensic accountants intercepted records from private, highly discreet auction houses and elite consignment brokers across the country. Natalie was secretly liquidating her most prized possessions just to keep the lights on and the mortgage paid. She quietly auctioned off the expensive contemporary art collection she had proudly displayed in her living room. She sold her imported designer handbags, her diamond jewelry, and her vintage luxury watches for pennies on the dollar to anonymous online buyers. She was frantically pawning the physical evidence of her stolen wealth just to buy herself one more month of pretending everything was perfectly fine. She was actively cannibalizing her own curated lifestyle, desperately trying to plug the massive holes in the sinking ship while keeping a bright, flawless smile plastered on her face for the country club cameras. From the quiet safety of my freezing mountain cabin, I observed their terrifying descent into absolute financial panic. I watched them drown in a deep ocean of toxic debt of their own creation. The staggering irony of the situation provided a profound sense of cold justice. 5 years ago, Natalie had looked me dead in the eye and accused me of being a thief. She had stripped me of my reputation and cast me out into the bitter cold to protect her fraudulent husband. Now she was the one living a wretched life of constant deception, terrified that her wealthy friends would discover she was nothing more than a desperate, impoverished fraud sleeping in an empty mansion. She was a prisoner in a cage made of unpaid bills and impending legal ruin. While she lay awake at night, trembling in the dark, and wondering how she was going to survive the next round of vicious collection calls, I slept soundly under the thick timber beams of my simple home. I had nothing to hide. I owed nothing to anyone. The bitter Colorado wind howling outside my frosted window was a soothing lullaby compared to the deafening roar of the collapsing financial empire tearing their lives apart. They were finally reaping the exact harvest they had sown with their own treacherous hands. Every single lie they had ever told was now demanding an immediate and brutal repayment in full. I felt absolutely no pity for the selfish monsters who had deliberately destroyed my good name to desperately save themselves from their own truly incredible, reckless stupidity. The precise moment had finally arrived to strike the final devastating blow. I did not need to wait for their inevitable bankruptcy. I had gathered enough irrefutable evidence to ensure they would never see the outside of a federal penitentiary for the rest of their natural lives. I sat down at my rough wooden table and opened the heavily encrypted files provided by the forensic accountants in Washington. I meticulously organized the raw data, the bank transfer logs, the forged medical trust documents, and the detailed trails of the offshore shell accounts. I connected the fraudulent real estate investments directly to the money stolen from my brother William. I printed every single page using a small battery-powered printer I had purchased specifically for this exact purpose. I carefully assembled the thick stack of damning documents into a comprehensive, perfectly structured legal dossier. I highlighted the most critical transactions and attached a sworn, notarized affidavit detailing exactly how my signature was digitally forged on the day of the funeral. I placed the massive stack of paper inside a heavy manila envelope and sealed it securely with thick adhesive tape. I wrote the direct mailing address for the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in bold black ink across the front of the package. I held the heavy envelope in my calloused hands, feeling the immense weight of the justice it contained. I was completely ready to walk down the mountain drive to the nearest post office and trigger the federal raid that would permanently end their miserable existence. I stood up from the wooden table, intending to put on my winter coat and make the drive to mail the package. The fire was burning low, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. I looked at the envelope, feeling absolute closure. The trap had worked flawlessly. The immense pressure of maintaining their fraudulent lifestyle had begun to dismantle them from the inside out. My intelligence network had not just provided me with bank statements and court filings. The investigators had also documented the severe physical and mental toll the impending collapse was taking on my daughter. Natalie had spent her entire adult life meticulously curating a flawless public image. She thrived on the envy of her peers and the false security of stolen wealth. But living in absolute terror, knowing a massive financial guillotine was hovering above her neck, had completely shattered her nerves. The private investigator reports detailed a rapid, disturbing downward spiral. Natalie had stopped sleeping. The sheer panic of dodging aggressive collection agencies and hiding their insolvency from her elite social circle had pushed her over the edge. To cope, she had turned to a highly toxic combination of coping mechanisms. The pharmacy records and credit card receipts painted a very clear, very grim picture. She was consuming heavy sedatives to numb her crippling anxiety during the day and mixing them with copious amounts of alcohol just to force herself to sleep. She was actively poisoning her own body to escape the reality of the monster she married and the monumental lies she told. The stress was eating her alive, fading her perfectly manicured appearance, transforming her into a fragile shell of the arrogant woman who pointed a finger at me 4 years ago. She had built a beautiful golden cage for herself, and now she was slowly suffocating inside of it. I felt absolutely no remorse as I reviewed those grim reports. She had made her choices with cold, calculated cruelty. Now she was paying the physiological tax of living a life devoid of truth. I reached for my thick wool coat hanging by the heavy wooden door, completely ready to deliver the final killing blow to their miserable empire. I was about to put it on when the silence of the cabin was pierced by a sharp ringing. I froze my hand, hovering midair. It was my burner cell phone. The device was sitting on the kitchen counter, vibrating aggressively against the cheap laminate surface. I only used that specific phone to communicate with the forensic accountants and the private investigators in Washington. Nobody else in the entire world possessed that encrypted number. I walked slowly across the creaking floorboards, my brow furrowed in deep confusion. I picked up the small plastic device and looked at the glowing digital screen. The caller identification did not display the familiar encrypted Washington routing code. It displayed an unknown, unregistered local area code from Chicago. My engineering mind immediately began running through the variables. A breach in my security protocol was statistically improbable but not entirely impossible. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, weighing the risks before swiping my thumb across the screen to accept the incoming call. I brought the phone to my ear, remaining completely silent, waiting for the caller to speak first. I expected to hear the cold, professional voice of a federal agent, or perhaps a desperate debt collector who had somehow traced a digital thread back to my original accounts. Instead, I heard the ragged, chaotic sound of someone gasping for air. It was a wet, heavy, desperate sound, followed by a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. "Hello," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat and entirely devoid of emotion. "Dad." A voice sobbed through the receiver. "Dad, please do not hang up on me. Please." The voice was completely fractured, distorted by violent, hysterical weeping, but I recognized it instantly. It was Jason, the arrogant, slick, commercial real estate broker. The man who had embezzled millions, framed me for his crimes, and bought a $4 million mansion with my stolen inheritance. He was crying so hard he could barely form coherent syllables. The pristine, confident facade he wore like a tailored suit was completely gone. He sounded like a terrified, broken child. "How did you get this number, Jason?" I asked, my tone as cold and unforgiving as the blizzard blowing outside my window. "I paid a private tracing firm." He wept, his breath hitching painfully in his chest. "I spent the last of my cash to find you. I am so sorry. I am so sorry for everything we did to you. But you have to listen to me. I have nowhere else to turn. Everyone else has abandoned us. We have nothing left. Please, Dad, you have to help us." "I am not your father," I replied calmly. "And I do not care about your financial problems. You stole your bed. Now you can sleep in it." No, it is not about the money," he screamed, his voice cracking with absolute raw panic. "It is Natalie. It is your daughter." I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, my knuckles turning white. The heavy manila envelope containing their federal indictment was sitting just a few feet away on the wooden table. "What about Natalie?" I demanded. "She collapsed," he sobbed, the sound echoing hollowly through the phone speaker. "We were at the Children's Hospital charity gala tonight. She was trying to pretend everything was fine. She mixed anxiety pills with too much champagne. Her body just gave out. She collapsed right there on the ballroom floor in front of everyone. The paramedics rushed her to City General Hospital. They said her system is completely shutting down from the toxicity and the stress." Jason paused, letting out a guttural, agonizing wail that chilled the blood in my veins. "She is in the intensive care unit, Dad. The doctors said the damage is catastrophic. She is dying." I did not reply to his desperate, pathetic wailing. I disconnected the call and stared at the dark screen. The manila envelope on my table, destined for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, suddenly felt different. It was no longer a weapon of justice. Nature and her own toxic choices were carrying out the death sentence. I packed my canvas bag in absolute silence, trading my winter boots for the polished shoes of the man I used to be. I drove my truck down the mountain roads in the dead of night, catching the first direct flight from Denver back to the city that exiled me. Chicago looked exactly the same, an imposing grid of steel and concrete under a bleak gray sky. I took a taxi straight to City General Hospital. Walking through those sliding glass doors felt like stepping back into a past life. The sterile smell of antiseptic and the harsh fluorescent lights brought chilling clarity to my mind. I navigated the labyrinth of white hallways until I reached the intensive care waiting room. The scene before me was a pathetic tableau of manufactured grief. Jason was slumped in a plastic chair, his designer suit wrinkled, his head buried in his hands. My nephew Brian stood near the window, frantically scrolling through his phone, looking profoundly annoyed by the inconvenience. When Jason looked up and saw me standing in the doorway, his eyes widened in shock. He had begged me to come, but he never expected me to actually walk through those doors. He scrambled to his feet, wiping his tear-stained face, attempting to play the devoted husband. Before he could utter a single word of false gratitude, the heavy double doors of the intensive care unit swung open. A tall man in pale blue surgical scrubs stepped into the waiting room. He looked exhausted, carrying a thick medical chart clipped to a sturdy plastic board. It was Dr. Gregory Miles, the chief of transplant surgery. Dr. Miles did not offer any comforting smiles. He was a man of science delivering cold, hard facts. He gathered us in a small consultation circle and delivered the catastrophic diagnosis with absolute, unflinching precision. Natalie was in the final irreversible stages of acute liver failure. The prolonged severe abuse of heavy prescription sedatives, combined with copious amounts of alcohol, had completely overwhelmed her organs. Her liver was practically destroyed, no longer capable of filtering the massive amount of toxins flooding her system. Her body was systematically shutting down. She had slipped into a hepatic coma, and the timeline for her survival was rapidly shrinking. Dr. Miles looked directly at Jason, his tone grave and urgent. "She needs a partial liver transplant," he explained, his voice echoing in the small space. "Because her condition has deteriorated so rapidly due to substance abuse, she is not eligible to wait on the National Donor Registry list. The screening protocols and wait times are far too long. She will not survive the week. Her only viable option for survival is a living donor. We need a healthy family member or a compatible spouse to donate a portion of their liver immediately. We have a maximum window of 48 hours to perform the surgery, or the systemic organ failure will become absolutely fatal." The silence that followed those words was deafening. Dr. Miles handed a stack of medical screening forms to Jason and Brian. I watched the two men, the wealthy inheritors of my stolen legacy, react to the immediate demand for physical sacrifice. The facade of their deep devotion crumbled right before my eyes. Brian took a sudden step backward, holding his hands up as if the forms were actively on fire. He shook his head vigorously, his face pale with raw cowardice. "I cannot do it," Brian stammered, his voice climbing an entire octave in pure panic. "I have my own family to think about. I have children. I cannot take on those kinds of extreme health risks. A major surgery like that could have severe complications. What if I do not recover properly? What if I get an infection? I am sorry, but I absolutely cannot risk my own life." He did not bother to pretend to read the screening paperwork. He just backed away, completely abandoning his cousin to her gruesome fate without a second thought. Then the entire room shifted its attention directly to Jason. He was her husband. He was the man she had sacrificed her own father for. He was the only one who was supposed to step up and save her life. Jason gripped the medical clipboard with trembling hands. He looked at the paperwork, then looked up at the ceiling, letting out a loud theatrical sob that echoed off the sterile walls. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking violently as he performed his carefully rehearsed act of devastating sorrow. "The doctor tested my blood type when she was admitted last night." Jason wept loudly, his voice choked with artificial despair. "We are incompatible. My blood type is wrong for a transplant. The antibodies would instantly reject my tissue. I cannot save her. I am useless. I would give anything to take her place, but medically, it is impossible to be her donor." Jason collapsed back into his plastic chair, burying his face to hide his features. But I stood perfectly still, watching his pathetic performance. He was crying, but his narrative was far too polished for a man supposedly watching his wife die. In that moment, the heavy, suffocating silence returned to the small consultation circle. Brian had refused. Jason was medically useless. Dr. Miles slowly lowered his clipboard. The surgeon turned his head, his tired eyes scanning the room until they settled on the only remaining option. Slowly, Jason lifted his head from his hands, turning his tear-streaked face toward me. Brian turned around, his eyes wide. Everyone in the room turned to look directly at the outcast. Me. Dr. Miles broke the heavy silence of the consultation room, asking if I would be willing to submit to a rapid blood and tissue compatibility testing procedure. I nodded once in a single definitive motion. A nurse quickly escorted me down a pristine white corridor to a small examination room. They drew my blood, checked my vitals, and ran a comprehensive panel of urgent diagnostics. For 3 agonizing hours, I sat alone in that sterile room, staring at the blank walls. My mind was a fortress of calculated thoughts. I was not praying for a medical miracle. I was simply waiting for the biological variables to align. When Dr. Miles finally returned, his expression was a mixture of profound relief and clinical seriousness. He closed the door securely behind him and looked me directly in the eye. "You are a perfect match, Richard," he said, his voice completely steady. "Your tissue typing is completely compatible with Natalie. Furthermore, despite your age, your cardiovascular health and liver function are exceptionally robust. The rigorous labor in the Colorado mountains had hardened my body, making me an ideal candidate for the grueling surgical extraction. You are fully capable of donating, the doctor confirmed. The choice to save her life is now entirely yours." I thanked the chief surgeon and stepped back out into the main intensive care waiting area. Jason was pacing the entire length of the hallway, his expensive leather shoes scuffing loudly against the polished linoleum floor. When he saw Dr. Miles nod affirmatively from the doorway behind me, Jason stopped dead in his tracks. The staggering realization hit him like a brutal physical blow. The outcast he had framed and banished half a decade ago was now the absolute sovereign ruler of his destiny. Jason rushed toward me, closing the distance between us in desperate, frantic strides. He did not stop at a polite, respectful distance. He collapsed entirely, dropping heavily to both of his knees right there in the middle of the busy hospital corridor. The polished, arrogant commercial real estate broker instantly vanished, replaced by a pathetic, weeping creature. He reached out and violently grabbed both of my hands, his palms sweaty and shaking uncontrollably. "Dad," he sobbed, forcing out massive crocodile tears that streaked down his perfectly manicured face. "Please, Dad, you absolutely have to do this. You are her only hope in the entire world. I know we made terrible, unforgivable mistakes in the past. I know awful things were said that can never be unsaid. But she is your daughter. She is your own flesh and blood." He tightened his desperate grip on my hands, shamelessly weaponizing the very concepts he had gleefully destroyed 5 years ago. "Please find it in your heart to forgive us. Show us the boundless fatherly love you always had. Do not let her die because of our stupid, selfish mistakes. She needs you to live. I need you to save my wife. Our family desperately needs you to be the bigger man and save her fragile life." I stood perfectly still in the brightly lit corridor, completely unmoved by his theatrical display of sorrow. I did not attempt to pull my calloused hands away from his desperate, clutching grip. I simply looked down at the top of his head, feeling absolutely nothing resembling fatherly love or divine forgiveness. My heart rate did not elevate a single beat. My breathing remained perfectly slow and mathematically measured. I was looking directly at the monster who had stolen $3 million, forged my digital signature to steal another $500,000, stripped me of my brother's lasting legacy, and pushed my daughter into a fatal, inescapable spiral of toxic debt and severe substance abuse. He was desperately using the word family as a convenient shield, hoping my biological instincts would somehow override my highly logical memory. He was actively praying that I was a weak, sentimental old fool who would forget the past for a few fake tears. He was terribly, catastrophically mistaken. I felt nothing but cold, absolute calculation running through my veins. The structural flaws in his pathetic performance were blindingly obvious to a trained eye. A man who truly loves his dying wife does not focus his pleas on his own need for forgiveness. A man genuinely terrified of losing his soulmate does not check his peripheral vision to see if passing nurses are watching his display. He was acting for an audience of one, trying to manipulate the last remaining variable that stood between him and total, undeniable exposure. I let him weep against my knuckles for a full minute, allowing the heavy, suffocating silence to stretch until it became physically uncomfortable for him. Slowly, his loud sobs began to falter, replaced by ragged, uncertain breaths. He looked up at me, his eyes searching my unreadable face for any sign of mercy, any glimmer of the vulnerable father he had so easily discarded. I slowly and deliberately pulled my hands out of his sweaty, shaking grasp. "I will give you my final answer very soon," I said, my voice completely smooth and dangerously calm. "But before I make a decision of this magnitude, I need an hour to prepare mentally for the surgical implications." I turned my back on his kneeling form and walked down the long corridor. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting long, pale shadows against the polished floors. Every single step I took felt incredibly deliberate, carrying the heavy weight of the monumental justice I was finally about to deliver to the man who ruined my entire life. Jason called out my name in desperation, but I did not stop walking. I did not head toward the quiet hospital chapel to pray for guidance. Instead, I walked straight out the sliding glass doors into the freezing courtyard, pulled out my encrypted burner phone, and made an immediate confidential call to Harrison Cole, the lawyer. The endgame had finally arrived. It was time to strike. The freezing wind whipped across the hospital courtyard, stinging my face, but I barely registered the bitter cold. I lifted the encrypted burner phone to my ear and waited for the secure digital connection to establish. Harrison Cole answered the line on the very first ring. Despite his unfortunate role in legally banishing me 5 years ago, Harrison was an attorney who valued undeniable facts over dramatic family theatrics. Over the past 6 months, he had secretly become my most crucial ally in Chicago, meticulously reviewing the forensic audits I had sent him from the mountains. I did not waste time with basic pleasantries. I told him I needed an immediate, highly intrusive favor. I instructed Harrison to utilize his most discreet private medical investigator to dig deep into Jason Bennett's health records. I wanted full access to the comprehensive blood work Jason had submitted for a massive life insurance policy 3 years ago. I authorized Harrison to pay whatever exorbitant premium was necessary to bypass standard bureaucratic delays and retrieve the raw data within the hour. Harrison warned me that doing so was highly unorthodox and extremely expensive. I told him I did not care about the massive financial cost. I needed to verify a critical structural anomaly in Jason's perfectly tragic story. I ended the call and sat down on a freezing concrete bench facing the main hospital entrance. The towering glass facade reflected the gray, unforgiving sky above. Behind those heavily tinted windows, my daughter was tethered to a dozen life support machines, her damaged organs failing with every passing minute. And just down the hall from her, Chester was actively continuing his masterful performance as the helpless, grieving husband. I ran through the cold logic in my head. Jason claimed his blood was completely incompatible because the hospital had tested him the previous night. But a man with millions of stolen dollars and a desperate need to maintain his freedom could easily bribe an exhausted night shift technician or swap a medical sample to ensure a negative result. Jason was a coward at his core, and cowards do not voluntarily lie down on operating tables to be carved open. They run. They deflect. They orchestrate elaborate illusions to perfectly mask their own selfish self-preservation. I sat perfectly still in the biting cold, calculating the exact trajectory of his deceit. I knew the man far too well to believe a single word that came out of his lying mouth. 45 minutes later, my phone vibrated intensely in my palm. A heavily encrypted email notification illuminated the small screen. Harrison had delivered exactly as promised. I entered my complex alphanumeric passcode and opened the attached medical file. It was a comprehensive physiological profile from an exclusive private clinic in downtown Chicago, dated exactly 36 months ago. I scrolled straight past the basic cholesterol levels and routine cardiovascular evaluations down to the definitive hematology report. There, printed in stark black and white, was the undeniable truth. Jason possessed the exact same rare blood type as my daughter. His tissue markers were flawlessly compatible. He was a perfect biological match. The loud theatrical sobbing in the corridor. The dramatic fall to his knees. The frantic claims of medical incompatibility. It was all a meticulously fabricated lie. He was entirely capable of donating the liver tissue required to save his wife. He simply chose not to do it. He chose to stand in that sterile hospital hallway and weep false tears while actively sealing her death warrant. But a coward's basic fear of physical pain was not a strong enough motive to explain the sheer magnitude of this terrible deception. My phone vibrated again. Harrison was calling me directly. His usually measured professional voice sounded uncharacteristically tense. He told me the medical investigator had found the blood work, but the financial team tracking Jason's compromised accounts had just flagged something significantly more disturbing. While Jason was standing in the intensive care unit watching his wife deteriorate, his private offshore accounts had been completely emptied. He had liquidated the last remaining scraps of my brother's stolen inheritance. Harrison then delivered the final devastating piece of the puzzle. An hour before Mana Natalie collapsed at the charity gala, Jason had used a masked corporate credit card to purchase a one-way first-class airline ticket. The departure date was scheduled for next Tuesday, just 4 days away. The final destination was a luxury resort town in Costa Rica, a country notoriously difficult for federal extradition. He had not purchased a ticket for a grieving widower seeking solitude. The itinerary clearly showed 2 passenger names. The second ticket belonged to a woman named Evelyn, a junior real estate associate who had been working closely with Jason for the past 2 years. The entire horrifying architecture of his master plan was finally exposed in the freezing courtyard. Jason knew the massive Ponzi scheme was days away from a catastrophic public collapse. He knew the federal indictments for massive embezzlement and wire fraud were imminent. If Natalie survived, she would inevitably be interrogated by aggressive federal agents, and she would undoubtedly implicate him to save herself. She had become a massive, terrifying liability to his personal freedom. His refusal to donate his liver was not just an act of extreme cowardice. It was a deliberate, calculated act of passive murder. Jason was actively planning to let his wife die in that hospital bed so he could play the innocent role of the tragic, mourning widower. He intended to collect the remaining scraps of the stolen inheritance, pack his bags, and flee the country with his young mistress before the federal authorities could officially freeze his passport. He was going to let my daughter suffocate on her own toxic blood just to orchestrate his perfect cowardly escape. I locked the bright screen of my phone and stood up from the freezing concrete bench. The long time for quiet observation was now completely and officially over. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped back into the suffocating warmth of the hospital lobby. The sterile scent of medical bleach hit my senses, but it did nothing to wash away the foul stench of betrayal clinging to the man waiting down the hall. I walked past the nurse's station with measured, deliberate strides. My face was a mask of pure stone. I did not look at the glowing monitors or the exhausted medical staff. My entire focus was narrowed down to a single brightly lit private consultation room at the very end of the intensive care corridor. I saw Jason sitting alone inside through the narrow rectangular window of the closed door. He was slouching in a faux leather chair, resting his elbows on his knees, holding his face in his hands. He was putting on a truly magnificent performance of a devastated spouse waiting for the inevitable end. I turned the cold metal handle and pushed the door open. The sudden noise made Jason jump in his seat. I stepped inside the small, windowless room and firmly pushed the door shut behind me. I reached down and turned the heavy deadbolt. The loud metallic click echoed like a gunshot in the confined space. Jason looked up at me, his eyes red and puffy from forcing out artificial tears. He immediately stood up, attempting to deploy that familiar, sickeningly sweet tone of fabricated vulnerability. "Dad," he began, his voice trembling perfectly. "Did you make a decision? Please tell me you are going to save her. I cannot lose my wife. I cannot live without her." I remained standing by the locked door. I did not offer him a comforting embrace. I did not utter a single word of familial reassurance. I simply stared at him. I looked at the slight tremor in his jaw. I looked at the expensive tailored suit that was paid for with my stolen legacy. I let the absolute crushing silence stretch between us for a very long time. An engineer understands that silence is the heaviest weight you can drop on a liar. Without words to react to their own guilt, begins to crush them from the inside out. Jason shifted his weight uncomfortably from one foot to the other. His confident posture began to falter under my unwavering, freezing gaze. The room suddenly felt incredibly small, suffocatingly tight, as the atmospheric pressure shifted entirely in my favor. I walked slowly toward the small, round consultation table separating us. I reached into the inside pocket of my dark wool coat. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell or scream or demand an explanation. I moved with the precise, calculated efficiency of a man dismantling a condemned building. I withdrew 2 pieces of folded paper, printed directly from the encrypted files Harrison had sent to my phone. I placed them face down on the smooth laminate surface of the table. With my index finger, I slowly slid the documents across the table until they stopped directly in front of Jason. I watched his eyes dart nervously from my face down to the folded sheets. "Read them," I commanded, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet, absolute whisper. Jason hesitated, his fingers trembling slightly, as he reached out and turned the first page over. It was the comprehensive hematology report from his private downtown clinic. I watched the exact moment his brain processed the medical terminology. I watched him read the stark, undeniable confirmation of his rare blood type and his flawless tissue compatibility. The artificial sorrow completely vanished from his face, replaced instantly by raw, unfiltered terror. Before he could even attempt to formulate a pathetic excuse, his eyes dropped to the second piece of paper. It was the detailed airline itinerary. A one-way first-class ticket to a luxury resort in Costa Rica, scheduled for next Tuesday, booked under his name and the name of his junior associate mistress. The blood drained out of Jason's face so rapidly, he looked like a fresh corpse. He went completely ghost white. His jaw opened, but no sound came out. The sophisticated, untouchable commercial real estate broker was suddenly reduced to a trembling, hyperventilating shell of a man. The carefully constructed facade he had worn for the past 5 years shattered into a million irreparable pieces right there on the consultation room floor. He tried to speak. He tried to stammer out some desperate, convoluted lie to explain away the damning evidence sitting right in front of him. He opened his mouth, gasping for air, like a fish thrown onto a dry wooden dock. "Dad, I can explain," he sputtered, his voice cracking and failing him completely. "The medical test is old. It must be a mistake. And the flight was just a business trip. I was trying to secure a deal to pay for her medical bills. Please, you have to believe me." His words were pathetic, utterly devoid of conviction. He knew he was trapped. He knew his elaborate, cowardly plan to let his wife suffocate on her own failing organs while he fled to a tropical paradise with his stolen millions was completely and irreversibly exposed. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white as he desperately tried to keep his legs from giving out beneath him. He was staring directly into the eyes of the man he had ruthlessly framed, realizing too late that the clueless old fool he banished was actually the architect of his absolute destruction. I did not entertain his pathetic, stammering lies. I did not dignify his desperate excuses with a response. Instead, I reached back into the deep inside pocket of my heavy winter coat. I pulled out the thick, legally binding dossier I meticulously assembled. I slammed the massive paperwork heavily onto the center of the table. "Sit down right now, Jason," I said. "We are going to negotiate the price of a human life." Jason collapsed back into the faux leather chair, his legs finally refusing to support his weight. He looked at the thick folder I had slammed onto the table, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. I did not rush. I slowly untied the string closure of the heavy dossier and carefully withdrew 2 distinct stacks of paper. I placed them side by side on the laminate surface, smoothing out the edges with the palm of my hand. I pointed to the thin stack on the left. "This is document A," I explained, my voice steady and completely devoid of warmth. "It is the official hospital surgical consent form. If I sign this piece of paper, the surgical team will immediately prep me for the operating room. I will voluntarily surrender a portion of my healthy liver, and your wife will survive the night." Jason stared at the medical form, a desperate glimmer of hope momentarily piercing through his absolute terror. He opened his mouth to speak, but I raised my hand, silencing him instantly. I then pointed my finger to the much thicker stack of paper resting on the right. "This is document B," I continued. "It is a comprehensive, legally binding confession drafted by my attorneys and supported by months of meticulous forensic accounting. It details every single aspect of your fraudulent existence. It outlines exactly how you embezzled $3 million from your commercial real estate clients. It documents the massive Ponzi scheme you constructed to hide your catastrophic losses. Most importantly, it contains a full admission that you forged my digital signature to steal $450,000 from the private medical trust to cover a desperate margin call." Jason stared at the thick stack of legal paper as if it were a venomous snake coiled on the table. He began to shake his head in frantic denial, but I pressed my finger firmly against the top page, demanding his undivided attention. "The confession does not stop there," I added quietly. "The final pages contain irrevocable deeds of transfer. By signing this document, you are legally signing over every single remaining real estate asset you currently possess directly to my name. The Chicago mansion, your commercial holding companies, your offshore accounts. Everything you bought with my stolen family legacy is returning to me immediately." "You are insane," Jason whispered, his voice vibrating with disbelief and rising anger. "You cannot possibly expect me to sign a document that sends me to federal prison and strips me of every single penny I have. I will be ruined." I leaned across the small table, closing the physical distance between us, until he was forced to look directly into my eyes. "You are already ruined, Jason. I am simply offering you a choice on how the final chapter is written." I pointed back to the two documents. "The terms of my negotiation are absolutely non-negotiable. You sign the confession, and I get on the operating table to save Natalie. You refuse, and I walk out that hospital door right now. I will catch the next flight back to Colorado, and you can sit in the waiting room and watch your wife slowly expire. And when she is gone, you will not be boarding a first-class flight to Costa Rica with your mistress. The Federal Bureau of Investigation will arrest you before the sun comes up tomorrow morning." His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The polished facade of the successful broker melted away, revealing a cornered, vicious animal. "You cannot do this," he snarled, pushing his chair back and standing up abruptly. "This is blackmail. This is illegal extortion. If you walk out that door, I will scream. I will call the police right now and tell them exactly what you are doing. I will tell the doctors you are demanding money for an organ. They will arrest you." I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I just stared at him with profound, icy pity. "Go ahead, Jason," I challenged him softly. "Scream as loud as you want. Call the hospital security. Call the police. But before you open your mouth, I want you to use that supposedly brilliant business mind of yours to calculate the immediate consequences. It is a federal crime to coerce someone into donating an organ. If you make a scene and claim I am extorting you, the hospital administration will immediately intervene. The ethics committee will automatically and permanently cancel the transplant surgery. They will not allow me to donate under any circumstances. Natalie will die on that table tonight. And tomorrow morning, my attorneys will still hand over this entire dossier to the federal authorities. The only difference is that you will be facing a judge as a widower." The brutal, inescapable logic of my trap slammed into him with the force of a freight train. He slowly looked around the small, windowless consultation room as if searching for a hidden exit, but there was nowhere left to run. He had spent the last 5 years building an elaborate maze of lies, and I had just locked the only door and set the entire structure on fire. His chest heaved violently as he fought a losing battle against his own overwhelming panic. He was completely out of options, out of money, and out of time. He collapsed heavily back into his cold plastic chair, desperately covering his tear-stained face with both of his trembling hands. A low, pathetic moan escaped his dry throat, a haunting sound of absolute, devastating defeat in the otherwise completely silent hospital room. The arrogant thief who had so confidently destroyed my hard-earned reputation and stolen my vast inheritance was finally completely broken. He very slowly reached across the smooth laminate table, his fingers shaking violently with a volatile mixture of blinding fury and suffocating fear, and he picked up the silver pen. The heavy silver pen hovered just an inch above the thick stack of legal paper. Jason stared down at the dotted line, his hand trembling so violently that the polished metal of the pen clicked faintly against his wedding band. He was accustomed to signing massive commercial contracts with effortless arrogance, but in this windowless room, writing his own name required a monumental struggle. I watched him swallow hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He pressed the tip of the pen with to the pavement. The sharp scratching sound filled the dead silence of the room. He signed the first page, acknowledging the theft of $450,000. He flipped the heavy sheet over. He signed the second page, detailing the massive Ponzi scheme that had consumed his client's money. He moved to the third section, his breathing ragged and shallow, and signed away the deed to his $4 million Chicago mansion. He signed away the offshore accounts. He signed away every single asset he had purchased with the inheritance he had stolen from me. I stood perfectly still, observing the subtle shifts in his facial expressions as he worked his way through the massive dossier. Behind the sheer terror, my trained eye caught a tiny flicker of desperate calculation. It was the desperate, surviving arrogance of a lifelong con artist. He looked at the volume of paperwork, and then at me, an old man about to undergo a highly invasive surgical procedure. I knew exactly what was running through his frantically calculating mind. He believed he was buying time. He thought that signing these papers was just a temporary setback. In his mind, he was rationalizing that the legal processing of such a massive property transfer would take days, perhaps even weeks, to officially clear the county records. More importantly, he knew that in less than an hour, I would be heavily anesthetized, lying completely unconscious on a hospital operating table with my abdomen sliced open. He foolishly believed that while I was incapacitated and recovering in the intensive care unit, he would still have his crucial 12-hour window. He thought he could walk right out of this hospital, grab his duffel bag, meet his junior associate mistress, and board that first-class flight to Costa Rica, long before these papers ever saw the inside of a courtroom. He was mentally packing his bags while signing his own ruin. I let him cling to that pathetic, cowardly delusion. It kept his hand moving across the pages. He reached the final document, a comprehensive sworn affidavit, confirming the absolute truth of his confession, and scrawled his signature one last time. He dropped the silver pen onto the table as if it had burned his fingers. He pushed the stack of papers back toward me, refusing to meet my eyes. He sat back in his chair, wiping the cold sweat from his pale forehead, visibly attempting to steady his ragged breathing. I calmly reached out and gathered the documents. I flipped through every page, checking each signature to ensure nothing had been deliberately altered. Everything was perfectly executed. The legal trap was completely finished. I secured the heavy dossier back inside my dark wool coat. I did not thank him. I did not offer a single word of parting advice. I simply turned around, unlocked the heavy deadbolt, and walked out of the consultation room without a backward glance. I stepped back into the brightly lit hospital corridor. Harrison Cole was standing exactly where I instructed, leaning against the white wall near the nurse station. The attorney looked up as I approached, his sharp eyes scanning my face for confirmation. I pulled the signed dossier from my coat and handed it directly to him. Harrison opened the folder, running his professional gaze over Jason's frantic, trembling signatures. A tight, deeply satisfied smile formed on the lawyer's face. He looked at me and gave a single definitive nod. I will file the property transfer deeds electronically with the county recorder. Right this second. Harrison said, his voice dropping to a low, completely businesslike whisper. The assets will be legally frozen and transferred to your name before you even reach the surgical wing. And the criminal confession is going straight to my secure courier. The district attorney will have it on her desk in less than 20 minutes. The extradition alert will be flagged on his passport immediately. He is not leaving this city. I thanked Harrison for his impeccable work, feeling a profound sense of closure wash over my tired bones. Surgical nurses approached me carrying hospital gowns and medical clearances. It was time to fulfill my end of the absolute bargain. They escorted me into a sterile preoperative bay. I stripped off my dark wool coat and polished shoes, trading the armor of vengeance for the vulnerable pale blue cotton of a patient. I lay down on the narrow, uncomfortable hospital bed. A nurse inserted an intravenous line into the back of my hand, securing it with tape. Dr. Gregory Miles stepped into the bay wearing his green scrubs and a surgical mask. He patted my shoulder, assuring me the surgical team was ready and Natalie was prepped in the adjoining theater. The anesthesiologist positioned himself behind my head, adjusting the valves on his machine. He placed a clear plastic oxygen mask over my nose and mouth, instructing me to take slow, deep breaths. I felt the cold, heavy liquid of the anesthesia begin to flow through the intravenous line, burning slightly as it traveled up my arm. The bright fluorescent lights above me slowly began to blur and soften. The steady beeping of the heart monitor started to echo, sounding further away with every passing second. The heavy weight of unconsciousness dragged me down into the quiet dark. As the absolute darkness finally takes me, I feel the ultimate peace of an engineer who has finally watched the flawed structure collapse exactly as calculated. I drifted upward through the thick layers of suffocating darkness. Consciousness did not return to me all at once. It arrived in fragmented, disorienting pieces. First came the persistent rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor echoing like a metronome in a vast empty room. Then came the harsh, bitter chemical smell of iodine and sanitized linens. Slowly, I forced my heavy eyelids open, fighting against the lingering sticky residue of the deep surgical anesthesia. The bright fluorescent light above my bed forced me to squint, blurring the sterile white ceiling tiles into a solid glowing mass. I tried to shift my weight on the firm mattress, and in that precise fraction of a second, reality slammed into my body with the brutal, blinding force of a swinging steel beam. A massive, searing line of agony ripped across my abdomen. It felt as though molten iron had been poured directly into my midsection. I gasped sharply, gripping the thin metal guardrails. The intake of air stretched my bruised diaphragm, sending a shockwave of pain through my ribs. I looked down at my chest, tethered to the wall by a complex network of clear plastic tubing. Intravenous lines fed saline and medication into my arms. A heavily bandaged incision stretched violently across my torso. My entire biological structure was fundamentally altered. I had paid the toll required to construct the trap. I closed my eyes and focused entirely on regulating my breathing, forcing shallow, measured breaths to prevent further agonizing spasms in my core. An engineer learns very early that every structural modification requires an equal and opposite distribution of weight. I had surrendered a significant portion of my own vital organ, and the resulting physical trauma was simply the expected stress load. The pain was immense, gnawing at the edges of my consciousness, but it was entirely manageable because it was accompanied by an unprecedented psychological clarity. The mental fog was completely gone, replaced by a razor-sharp, crystalline focus. I lay listening to the steady beep of the machines, mentally reviewing the exact timeline of events. It had been 48 hours since the anesthesiologist put me to sleep. During those crucial hours, my carefully calculated demolition had been fully executed. Harrison Cole had filed the property deeds with the county recorder. The millions in stolen real estate assets were already locked securely back in my name. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had received Jason's sworn confession. The unyielding gears of the federal justice system were already grinding forward, crushing the desperate coward who thought he could fly away to a tropical paradise. The heavy burden of betrayal I had carried alone in Colorado was finally lifted. The physical wound would heal over time, but the structural integrity of my life had been perfectly restored. The heavy wooden door to my recovery room swung open with a quiet whoosh. Dr. Gregory Miles stepped inside carrying a digital tablet. He looked down at the glowing screen before looking up with a tired but satisfied smile. He walked over to my bed, checking the fluid levels in my intravenous bags and inspecting the edges of my heavy surgical dressing. "You are finally awake, Richard," the surgeon said, his voice calm and reassuring. "The procedure was incredibly demanding, but the surgery was a complete success. We safely extracted the necessary lobe of your liver without unforeseen vascular complications. Your vital signs are strong, and your preliminary blood work shows your remaining tissue is already beginning the natural regeneration process." I swallowed dryly, my throat feeling like rough sandpaper. I slowly forced the quiet words out. "And Natalie." Dr. Miles nodded, his expression softening slightly. "The graft was successful," he confirmed. "We transplanted your healthy tissue into her system, and the initial vascular connections are holding perfectly. We have been monitoring her closely, and there are absolutely no signs of acute rejection. Her enzyme levels are steadily dropping back into a manageable range, and her systemic toxicity is clearing. She has a very long road of rehabilitation ahead of her, but the immediate crisis has been averted. She is stabilizing. She is going to live." I absorbed the medical report in total silence. The biological contract had been fulfilled to the letter. I had given my daughter a second chance at life. I had removed her from the brink of a dark, toxic death. My hands, the same hands she falsely accused of theft, had literally saved her existence. The surgical debt was paid in full. I did not feel a sudden rush of fatherly warmth or tearful relief. I only felt the profound, chilling satisfaction of a transaction flawlessly completed. Dr. Miles made a few final medical notes and promised to return later. He quietly exited the room, leaving me alone with the rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor. A few minutes later, a young nurse quietly entered the room to adjust my pain medication. She checked the digital readouts on the machines behind my head and documented the numbers on a small clipboard. She paused by the side of my bed, offering a hesitant, sympathetic smile. "I know you are in a tremendous amount of pain right now, Mr. Caldwell," she said softly, her voice hushed. "But I thought you might want to know the latest update from the East Wing. Your daughter Natalie was finally taken off the heavy sedation this morning. She has fully regained consciousness." I turned my head slightly, ignoring the sharp pull of the stitches across my abdomen, and looked directly into the nurse's eyes. "She is awake," the nurse repeated, her expression filled with a bright, innocent hope. "And ever since she opened her eyes, she has been desperately asking to see you. She knows exactly what you did to save her life. She is begging the medical hospital staff to let her speak with her father today." I looked at the nurse, my expression unchanged by her hopeful news. I instructed her to coordinate with the physician and arrange a wheelchair. I told her I was ready to see my daughter immediately. The nurse hesitated, citing the trauma my body had endured, but my quiet insistence left no room for debate. Within 30 minutes, an orderly arrived with a sturdy transport chair. Getting out of the hospital bed was an excruciating ordeal. Every muscle in my abdomen screamed in protest, burning with the intensity of torn flesh and fresh sutures. I clenched my jaw, refusing to let a groan escape my lips, as the orderly helped me pivot and lower my weight into the chair. I wrapped a thick gray hospital robe tightly around my shoulders, concealing the network of medical tubing still tethered to my body. The orderly pushed my wheelchair out of the recovery room and down the long, sterile corridor toward the East Wing. The journey felt like a slow, deliberate march toward an inevitable reckoning. The rhythmic squeak of the rubber wheels against the polished linoleum floor served as the only soundtrack to my focused thoughts. I was not a loving father rushing to comfort his sick child. I was an engineer returning to a compromised site to deliver the final structural assessment. We reached a set of heavy double doors, and the orderly pushed me through into the intensive care unit. He guided my wheelchair into a private, heavily monitored room at the far end of the hall. The orderly quietly locked the brakes on the wheels and stepped outside, closing the heavy wooden door behind him. I sat perfectly still, observing the stark reality of the space. The room was dominated by the rhythmic hissing and pumping of advanced life support machinery. Lying in the center of the mechanical chaos was Natalie. The contrast between the woman in the bed and the arrogant art director who had framed me 5 years ago was staggering. Her formerly flawless sun-kissed skin was now a sickly translucent shade of pale yellow. Her meticulously styled hair was matted and dull against the thin hospital pillow. Dark, bruised circles framed her sunken eyes, and a complex web of intravenous lines fed directly into the veins of her frail, trembling arms. The lavish, untouchable lifestyle she had murdered my reputation to maintain had dissolved, leaving behind a broken, highly toxic shell. She looked incredibly weak, stripped of every single defensive layer of stolen wealth and false superiority. When she heard the soft click of the door closing, Natalie slowly turned her head toward me. Her sunken eyes widened rapidly, filling with thick, heavy tears. She let out a weak, ragged gasp, struggling to push herself up against the elevated mattress. "Dad," she whispered, her voice incredibly fragile and trembling with raw emotion. "You came. You actually came." I watched the heavy tears spill over her pale cheeks, tracking down her face to soak the collar of her hospital gown. She reached her thin, bruised hand out across the sterile metal guardrail, her fingers shaking as they stretched desperately toward my wheelchair. I did not move to close the distance. I simply watched her perform. "You saved me," she sobbed, the tears flowing freely now. "The doctors told me everything. They told me I was going to die, and you stepped in. You gave me a piece of yourself after everything I did. You are my hero, Dad. I am so unbelievably sorry. I was so wrong. I was lost and scared. And Jason pushed me into making terrible decisions. I want to make it right. I want us to start over and be a real family again. I promise I will change. We can fix everything." Her weeping echoed in the small, sterile room, bouncing off the plastic medical monitors. She was deploying the exact same weaponized sentimentality that her cowardly husband had attempted to use in the hallway just 2 days prior. She truly believed that my willingness to endure a grueling surgical procedure meant that my heart had softened. She assumed that by giving her a piece of my liver, I had implicitly offered her my total forgiveness. She expected me to lean forward, grasp her outstretched, trembling hand, and tell her that the past was entirely forgotten. She expected the unconditional, foolish love of a broken old man. I did not smile. I did not offer a single word of comforting fatherly reassurance. I slowly leaned forward in my wheelchair, ignoring the sharp, agonizing pull of the fresh stitches in my abdomen. I reached my hand out, but not to comfort her, as her shaking fingers brushed against my palm, anticipating a warm, loving grasp. I deliberately and coldly pulled my hand away. I rested my hands flat on the armrests of my wheelchair, locking my gaze completely onto hers. The sudden, freezing rejection hit her like a physical strike. Her desperate, hopeful smile instantly faltered, melting into a look of profound, terrified confusion. Her trembling hand slowly dropped back down onto the white hospital blanket. The heavy, suffocating silence of the intensive care room returned, broken only by the steady, mechanical hiss of the oxygen machine. I looked down at the woman who had mercilessly destroyed my life for her own selfish greed. She was waiting for redemption, waiting for the warm embrace of a family she had gleefully betrayed. I reached my right hand deep into the oversized pocket of my gray hospital robe. I withdrew a thick, securely sealed manila folder. I leaned forward one final time and dropped the heavy package directly onto the center of her rolling metal hospital tray. The sharp slap of the paper against the metal tray made her flinch. I looked directly into her terrified, sunken eyes. "I did not come here for a reunion, Natalie," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing, absolute whisper. "I came to give you your discharge gifts." Natalie stared down at the heavy manila folder resting on the metal tray. Her trembling fingers hesitated just above the flap. She looked at me, her sunken eyes searching my face for any sign of a joke, but found nothing but unyielding stone. With a ragged breath, she pulled back the thick cover and withdrew the first document. It was a crisp, legally bound copy of the confession Jason had signed. I watched her pale eyes scan the dense text, darting back and forth. as her exhausted brain struggled to process the devastating reality of his absolute surrender. "That is document number 1, I said, my voice echoing coldly in the sterile room. "It is a comprehensive confession fully signed and notarized by the man you sacrificed my life to protect." In those pages, Jason meticulously details exactly how he embezzled millions of dollars from his real estate clients. Furthermore, he fully admits to forging my digital signature to steal $450,000 from your Uncle William and his medical trust to cover failing margin calls. He explicitly confesses that you both conspired to use me as the perfect scapegoat. Natalie let out a choked gasp. Her frail hands shook so violently that the paper rattled against the tray. She stared at the unmistakable signature, at the bottom of the page, the undeniable proof of his capitulation. The false tears of joyous reunion she shed moments ago instantly vanished, replaced by a suffocating horror. But the systematic dismantling of her golden cage was only beginning. She pushed the confession aside with trembling fingers, revealing the second document I had deliberately placed in the stack. It was a brightly colored printout of a luxury airline itinerary. Natalie squinted at the paper, her brow furrowing in deep confusion as she read the departure details. It was a one-way first-class ticket to a highly exclusive resort town in Costa Rica. The flight was scheduled to depart next Tuesday. The reservation clearly listed 2 passengers. The first name was Jason Bennett. The second name was Evelyn, the junior real estate associate who had been working directly under him for 2 years. I leaned forward in my wheelchair, watching the final weight of the truth completely shatter her fragile reality. "You stole my name and the legacy of my brother to protect a man who was literally waiting for you to die," I told her, making sure every syllable struck her like a physical blow. "When your organs began to fail and the doctors begged for a living donor, Jason refused to get tested. He stood in the hallway and cried fake tears, claiming his blood type was incompatible. But my attorneys pulled his private medical records. He was a perfect match. He chose to let your body shut down. He planned to play the tragic widower, collect the remaining scraps of the stolen inheritance, and board that tropical flight with his mistress to escape federal indictment. He was going to leave you to suffocate in this very bed." Natalie let out an agonizing wail. It was the horrific sound of a woman realizing her entire existence was built on absolute betrayal. She clutched the itinerary to her chest, sobbing uncontrollably as the brutal reality tore through her fragile body. Her perfect marriage, her vast wealth, her high social standing, it had all been a grotesque lie. But I was not finished. There was still one final piece of paper waiting for her on the metal tray. She slowly lowered the airline tickets, her eyes dropping to the third and final document. It was a stark black and white official notice bearing the heavily embossed seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It was a comprehensive asset freeze and seizure order. "That final document is simply the inevitable consequence of your collective greed," I explained, maintaining my freezing, detached tone. When I gave Jason the choice to sign that confession, I also demanded the immediate transfer of every single property, offshore account, and luxury asset back into my name. Whatever remained has now been officially seized by the federal authorities. Your sprawling Chicago mansion is gone. Your bank accounts are entirely frozen. Your luxury vehicles have been impounded. You have absolutely nothing left, Natalie. The vast fortune you destroyed my reputation to steal has been completely wiped off the face of the earth." The medical monitors surrounding her bed began to beep rapidly, registering her skyrocketing heart rate and panicked, shallow breathing. Natalie pushed the heavy documents away, throwing her head back against the thin hospital pillow as a fresh wave of devastating sobs racked her body. She was completely broken, drowning in the inescapable consequences of her own monumental deception. She looked at me through her thick, heavy tears, her face contorted in pure, unadulterated terror. "Dad. Please," she begged, her voice cracking and fading into a pathetic wheeze. "Do not do this to me. I have absolutely nothing left. I have no money, no home, no husband. I cannot survive on the streets. Where will I go when they discharge me from this hospital?" How will I pay for my medical recovery? How will I survive? You cannot just leave me here with nothing. Please, I am begging you. You really have to help me. I am your daughter. I sat perfectly still in my wheelchair, feeling the dull, persistent ache of my fresh surgical incision. I listened to her desperate, pathetic pleas echoing off the sterile walls of the intensive care unit. She was begging for the very same mercy she had ruthlessly denied me 5 years ago when she stood in that mahogany conference room and stripped me of my dignity. I did not reach out to comfort her. I did not offer her a single penny of my reclaimed wealth. I looked down at her frail, trembling form, with eyes like ice, feeling absolutely no pity for the selfish monster she had chosen to become. The rapid, frantic beeping of the cardiac monitors filled the heavy silence between us, serving as a harsh mechanical soundtrack to her absolute despair. Natalie gripped the edge of her hospital bed, her knuckles stark white against the thin blue blanket. She leaned her frail body forward, fighting against the complex web of intravenous tubes tethered to her arms. She looked like a drowning victim, desperately reaching for a lifeline that was already pulled far out of her reach. "Dad, you have to listen to me," she choked out, her voice breaking into a ragged, pathetic wheeze. "You cannot just walk away and leave me with absolutely nothing. I have no money for my massive medical bills. I have no home to return to when they finally discharge me from this hospital. Jason took everything and left me to die, but you are my father. You are supposed to protect me. You are supposed to be the one person who never gives up on me. Please, I know I made unforgivable mistakes, but I am begging you to help me survive this. Do not let me end up on the freezing streets." I sat motionless in my transport wheelchair, listening to the hollow echo of her desperate bargaining. A structural engineer knows that when a building has fundamentally failed due to toxic internal rot, pouring new concrete over the shattered foundation will never save the structure. It will only delay the inevitable collapse. For 5 long, terrible years, I had lived in a freezing, isolated mountain cabin, counting the dark days, while she paraded around Chicago high society, wearing diamonds bought with my stolen reputation. She had never once paused to wonder if I was freezing. She had never once called to ask if I was starving on my modest pension. She had happily built her luxurious, glittering palace directly on top of my shallow grave. And now, facing the brutal, catastrophic consequences of her own horrific greed, she had the sheer audacity to demand my paternal protection. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the sharp, burning pull of the fresh surgical staples stretching across my abdomen. I rested my calloused hands flat against the cold metal armrests of my wheelchair. I looked directly into her terrified, sunken eyes, stripping away the very last illusion of comfort she was frantically clinging to. "I gave you a second chance at life, Natalie," I said, my voice steady, resonant, and completely stripped of any familial warmth. I laid down on a surgical table and allowed them to carve open my body to replace the organ you destroyed with your own toxic choices. I did that because I am not a murderer. I refused to let you die when I possessed the biological capacity to save you. But do not mistake my surgical donation for absolute absolution. I paused, letting the heavy, suffocating weight of my words settle permanently over her trembling shoulders. But my $12 million, my hard-earned professional reputation, and your cowardly husband, his personal freedom, I took all of that back. I meticulously dismantled the fraudulent empire you built on my name, and I reclaimed every single asset you stole from my brother, his legacy. 5 years ago, you stood in a mahogany conference room, looked me dead in the eye, and called me a thief in front of our entire family. You stripped me of my dignity without a single shred of hesitation. Now you get to experience the absolute brutal reality of your actions. Enjoy the life of someone who does not have a single dime to her name. Enjoy the crippling, suffocating panic of wondering exactly how you will afford your next meal. Natalie let out a devastating, guttural scream that tore violently through her ruined vocal cords. She lunged forward, her shaking fingers desperately clawing at the empty air between us, but I was already moving. I gripped the hard rubber wheels of my transport chair and pushed firmly backward. The chair rotated smoothly on the polished linoleum floor, turning my back to her completely. The sudden physical exertion sent a fresh, blinding wave of agony shooting directly through my healing core, but I truly welcomed the sharp, intense pain. It was the absolute, undeniable proof that I was still alive, and that the brutal, lingering debt between us had finally been settled in full. I kept my gaze fixed firmly on the door, refusing to offer her even a fleeting glance of sympathy. "Dad, come back!" She shrieked, the terrible sound cracking violently as it echoed off the sterile white hospital walls. "Do not leave me here all alone. You cannot do this to me." I completely ignored her frantic, hysterical cries. I pushed the wheels forward, propelling myself toward the exit, with slow, methodical, and unwavering precision. The distance from her bedside to the threshold felt like 1,000,000 miles, but I covered it without a single moment of hesitation. I reached the doorway and carefully maneuvered my heavy chair across the metal threshold, stepping out into the brightly lit, intensive care corridor. I did not reach back to pull the heavy, solid wooden door shut behind me. I deliberately left it standing wide open. As I wheeled myself slowly down the long, quiet hallway toward the recovery wing, the agonizing, pathetic sound of her ultimate realization spilled freely out of the room, echoing loudly and permanently behind me for absolutely everyone on the entire medical floor to clearly hear. The unyielding architecture of my meticulous vengeance was now entirely flawless and complete. My work in this wretched building was finally done. I was perfectly ready to watch the rest of the structure completely fall apart, exactly as I planned it years ago. My legacy was secure again. I moved onward into the blinding white hospital light, leaving her completely broken and weeping alone in the cold, dark shadows of her very own terrible creation, now waiting for the ultimate end. The orderly met me at the end of the intensive care corridor, silently taking the handles of my wheelchair. We entered the large service elevator, and the heavy metal doors slid shut, sealing away the chaotic medical wing and the broken woman I had left behind. The descent to the ground floor was remarkably smooth, but my bruised abdomen throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. I leaned my head back against the vinyl headrest of the transport chair, staring up at the bright ceiling panel. The surgical painkillers were beginning to wear off, allowing physical reality to pierce through my mental focus. But the psychological triumph I felt was a far stronger anesthetic than anything the doctors could prescribe. The heavy burden of fabricated guilt was permanently lifted from my shoulders. The elevator chimed softly, announcing our arrival at the main concourse. The doors opened, revealing the sprawling hospital lobby. The lobby was a hive of frantic activity. Nurses rushed past with clipboards and anxious families huddled together on uncomfortable waiting room chairs. The orderly pushed my wheelchair smoothly across the highly polished terrazzo floor, navigating through the thick sea of distracted people toward the main patient discharge exit. My private medical transport van was waiting for me in the designated loading zone just outside. I adjusted the thick gray hospital robe around my shoulders, preparing to face the biting winter wind. As we approached the massive revolving glass doors, a sudden erratic burst of movement caught the corner of my eye. My sharp engineering instincts instantly locked onto the anomaly. It was Jason. He was sprinting frantically across the far side of the crowded lobby, violently shoving past a group of startled elderly patients. He was no longer wearing his immaculate, custom-tailored suit. He had hastily changed into dark sweatpants, a hooded sweatshirt, and a baseball cap pulled down low over his eyes. He was clutching a massive, overstuffed black duffel bag tightly against his chest, holding it as if his life depended on it. His face was slick with terrified sweat, and his eyes darted wildly in every direction. He knew the federal indictments were unsealed. His window to escape to a tropical paradise with his stolen millions had evaporated. He was making a frantic dash for freedom. I raised my hand silently, signaling the orderly to stop my wheelchair just a few feet away from the expansive glass wall. I sat perfectly still, observing the final seconds of my son-in-law's miserable freedom. Jason crashed through the manual side door next to the revolving glass entrance, stumbling out onto the freezing concrete pavement. A bright yellow city taxi was idling near the curb, its exhaust billowing white clouds into the freezing air. Jason sprinted toward the idling vehicle, waving his free arm wildly to get the driver's attention. He reached out his hand, wrapping desperately around the yellow door handle. He actually believed he had successfully outsmarted the federal government. He was catastrophically mistaken. Before Jason could even pull the taxi door open, the deafening shriek of heavy rubber tires skidding violently against frozen asphalt shattered the quiet winter afternoon. 3 heavily armored black sport utility vehicles practically flew around the corner of the hospital driveway, moving with terrifying coordinated precision. They slammed on their brakes, completely boxing in the yellow taxi and blocking Jason's only path to the street. The heavy doors of the unmarked vehicles flew open simultaneously. A dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical vests with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation swarmed out into the freezing air. They moved with absolute overwhelming force, shouting loud, unmistakable commands. Jason froze, dropping his heavy black duffel bag onto the frozen concrete. The bag hit the ground with a dull thud, spilling a thick stack of tightly banded $100 bills onto the pavement. He took one pathetic, hesitant step backward, his eyes wide with pure, unadulterated terror, but there was nowhere left to run. 2 massive federal agents lunged forward, grabbing Jason by the shoulders of his dark hooded sweatshirt. They spun him around with brutal, unapologetic force, slamming him violently face first against the cold, hard steel hood of the nearest black utility vehicle. His cheek hit the metal with a sickening thud. The agents forcefully wrenched his arms behind his back, twisting his wrists together. The sharp, unmistakable click of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely into place echoed clearly through the freezing air. The entire hospital lobby had ground to an absolute halt. Dozens of nurses, doctors, and visiting families pressed themselves tightly against the massive glass walls, staring in stunned silence at the spectacular public takedown happening right outside the main entrance. Jason was completely humiliated, pinned against a vehicle, and surrounded by heavily armed federal authorities. One of the senior agents leaned in close to Jason's ear, pulling a folded piece of paper from his tactical vest. I knew exactly what was happening outside. The agent was officially reading him his constitutional rights, informing him of the monumental list of federal embezzlement and wire fraud charges. As the agents roughly hauled him off the hood of the vehicle, dragging him toward the back of an armored transport, Jason frantically turned his head. His terrified, desperate eyes scanned the crowded hospital lobby through the glass, searching for any sign of hope. His gaze swept past the shocked doctors and the bewildered nurses until it finally locked directly onto me. The overwhelming realization of his total failure crushed him completely. I sat motionless in my wheelchair, separated from him by a single pane of thick glass. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I looked directly into the eyes of the broken thief who had tried to destroy my existence. It was the perfect, undeniable conclusion to my meticulous design. As the heavy steel doors of the federal transport vehicle prepared to slam shut on his miserable life forever, I raised my chin and gave him one single deliberate nod. The heavy steel doors of the federal transport vehicle slammed shut, sealing away the architect of my destruction. The flashing red and blue lights faded into the distance of the Chicago streets, leaving behind a profound, resounding silence in my mind. I instructed the orderly to wheel me into the waiting medical transport van, completely ready to begin the final phase of my physical recovery. The next few months were a grueling test of my biological endurance. The surgical incision across my abdomen healed slowly, demanding patience and absolute discipline. But as my body repaired its torn tissues, the complex legal machinery I had set into motion meticulously repaired my life. Harrison Cole executed the asset transfers with flawless precision. The public indictments unsealed by the federal prosecutors completely exonerated me. The media narratives that had once painted me as a greedy, opportunistic thief were swiftly rewritten. The entire city learned the undeniable truth. I was the victim of a calculated, malicious framing orchestrated by my own family. The $12 million inheritance that my brother William had intended for me was finally officially restored to my name. I did not stay in Chicago to bask in the sudden wave of public apologies and sympathetic handshakes from the elite circles who had previously shunned me. Once medically cleared, I packed my simple bag and returned immediately to the freezing mountains of Colorado. The scales of justice balanced themselves with absolute, uncompromising severity. Jason Bennett did not receive a plea deal or a lenient sentence. The sheer volume of his embezzlement, combined with the comprehensive signed confession I had extracted from him, left his defense attorneys with absolutely nothing to negotiate. He was swiftly convicted and sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He traded his bespoke Italian suits and sports cars for an orange jumpsuit and a concrete cell. He will be an old, broken man by the time he ever sees the outside of those prison walls. Natalie survived her catastrophic organ failure thanks entirely to the grafted tissue I provided. But her recovery marked the beginning of a completely different kind of agonizing sentence. She was discharged from the hospital into a reality stripped of every single luxury she had ever known. The federal asset freezes wiped out her bank accounts, and civil restitution judgments from Jason's defrauded clients consumed whatever scraps remained. My daughter, the former high society art director, who had sneered at my honest pension, was forced to declare total bankruptcy. My private investigators provided one final conclusive update before I closed their contract. Natalie is currently living in a cramped, drafty studio apartment on the far outskirts of the city. She works long, exhausting shifts at a minimum-wage retail job just to afford basic groceries and make her court-ordered restitution payments. She is entirely alone, carrying the heavy, inescapable ghost of her own devastating choices. With the $12 million resting securely in my accounts, I faced a monumental choice regarding the remainder of my life. I could have easily purchased a sprawling luxury estate, traveled the globe in private jets, or draped myself in the same empty, glittering excess that had ultimately destroyed my daughter. But a structural engineer knows that adding unnecessary weight to a stable foundation only creates new, hidden vulnerabilities. I chose to remain in my weathered timber cabin. I kept my rusty truck and my wood-burning stove. I did not need a mansion to validate my existence. Instead, I channeled the entirety of my newfound wealth into a permanent, meaningful foundation. I worked with Harrison Cole to establish the William Caldwell Memorial Engineering Scholarship. I dedicated millions to fully fund the university education of hardworking young men and women from underprivileged backgrounds. I wanted to invest in students who possessed the grit, the raw intelligence, and the unwavering integrity to actually build enduring things in this world, rather than dedicating their lives to tearing other people down. I used my brother's legacy to forge a new generation of creators, ensuring that his hard-earned fortune would construct bridges to a better future for those who truly deserved a solid chance. It was the absolute perfect tribute to a man who had spent his entire life working tirelessly to elevate everyone around him. The harsh Colorado winter has returned, blanketing the towering pine trees in thick, heavy layers of pristine white snow. I sit quietly on the rough wooden porch of my cabin, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, watching the sun slowly rise over the jagged mountain peaks. I hold a chipped ceramic mug of bitter black coffee in my hands, letting the rising steam warm my weathered face. When the freezing mountain wind blows particularly hard, the long, jagged surgical scar across my abdomen throbs with a dull, persistent ache. I do not resent the pain. I welcome it. It is a profoundly good, honest pain. It serves as a physical reminder of exactly what I survived. It is the deep settling ache of a structural foundation that has successfully endured the absolute ultimate stress test and remained standing tall. My family attempted to completely demolish my life, assuming I was a weak, crumbling pillar they could easily knock down and replace. They fundamentally misunderstood the sheer strength of the materials I am made of. I take a slow, deliberate sip of my dark coffee, breathing in the crisp, freezing mountain air. The vast wilderness stretching out before me is perfectly quiet, perfectly still, and entirely free of deception. I am completely alone, but I have never felt more at peace in my entire 70 years of existence. The suffocating debris of the past has been cleared away, leaving only solid bedrock beneath my feet. I look out over the majestic snow-capped mountains, knowing the absolute undeniable rule of physics and life. The truth, no matter how deeply it is buried or how violently it is attacked, always holds its weight. To everyone listening to my story today, I leave you with a lesson learned from a lifetime of calculating weight and surviving betrayal. You cannot build a strong family on a foundation of lies, just like you cannot build a bridge over a rotten pillar. Forgiveness is a beautiful concept, but it must be earned through genuine repentance, not demanded out of desperation. Setting boundaries and enforcing consequences is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-respect. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for a toxic family member is to step aside and let them face the brutal reality of their own choices. Did you like my story, and which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you have ever had to set strict boundaries with family members who underestimated your worth, or if you survived a painful betrayal, please share your experience below. It makes this old engineer very happy to know who is on the other side listening to me, and at what moment of your day you took a little time to hear my story. If you liked the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I am looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There is so much more on my channel. Do not forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story. With love and respect.